Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. This is Counting the Costs on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, a battle for the heart of OPEC. Who will capitulate first, Putin or MBS, as a price war decimates the markets? Will the most liberal democratic nations buy Beijing's AI facial recognition technology to control their citizens? And the Lebanese lived a dream that was a delusion while Lebanon was drowning in debt. Words of the Prime Minister as his country defaulted on its debt for the very first time. Well, at a time when the world is dealing with the fast-spreading coronavirus that has decimated supply chains, induced panic buying and grounded flights, the last thing it needed was two nations declaring economic war. Well, Saudi Arabia and Russia have been working together to prop up oil prices for the last 3 years, but fell out over Riyadh's insistence that they agree to cut oil supplies by 1.5 million barrels a day. The reason was simple. China, the biggest importer of oil, was turning back tankers as the coronavirus forced the economy to a standstill. Well, oil prices have had their biggest one-day crash since the 1991 Gulf War, and there's more pain to come as Saudi Arabia and Russia flood the market with more oil. Goldman Sachs predict that oil prices could hit $20 a barrel. Both nations should be able to stomach a protracted economic war. Saudi Arabia has foreign exchange reserves of $490 billion. And Russia has reserves of $440 billion. Foreign reserves, of course, are important. Without them, an economy can grind to a halt, unable to pay for imports and pay for its debt. That is where it becomes a little more tricky. Saudi Arabia may need to borrow money to fill in between what is spent and the revenue it receives. It needs oil prices at around $82 a barrel to balance its budget. And Russia, according to the International Monetary Fund, needs oil at $42 a barrel there. But for economies weaning themselves off oil dependency, it means they have less money to spend in those areas. But what's at the heart of the fallout? Well, Russia has been angered by sanctions targeted at Rosneft Trading, a subsidiary of the Russian oil giant. Washington imposed the sanctions last month over its continued support in selling Venezuela's oil. Well, in return, Moscow was hoping to get Riyadh on side to inflict economic pain on US shale producers, who Moscow feels have been taking a free ride on the back of OPEC Plus's cuts in production. Well, shale production has pushed the United States into the #1 spot as the world's biggest producer of oil. Moscow hopes it could lead to the collapse of some of those businesses if oil prices remain below $40 a barrel. So let's get some analysis now. Joining me from London is Naeem Aslam. He's Chief Market Analyst at Ava Trade. Naeem, good to have you on the programme. How long do you think Saudi Arabia and Russia can keep up this fight and weather low oil prices?
They can't keep up for this fight for long. Why? Because it is killing both countries' economy. Oil, where it is trading currently, isn't really good for Russia or for Saudi Arabia. So I think it is better for both countries to throw in the towel and be more sensible with their approach, which is curbing the oil supply, which the market really needs. Otherwise, this 30% one-day drop that we've seen because of the failure of these two particular countries curbing the supply can get even more worse in the market.
So, Naeem, do you think then that the two sides can reconcile their differences and perhaps get OPEC Plus back together? I mean, and is this a fight about who controls OPEC, MBS or Putin?
To answer the latter part, who controls the fight is obviously MBS is in the driving seat. Putin isn't even in the picture with respect to that. And yes, the fight was, it all started with Russia not coming to the table and not willing to curb the supply. But MBS took it to a different level when Saudi Arabia announced that it is going to increase its oil production to 12.3 million barrels per day. So I think both countries, as I said before, really need to consider the situation carefully. And through this concept is that who is going to control the narrative with respect to OPEC. I think now is the time that the oil supply should be massively curbed and that is the only situation where we can see some sort of a resolution with respect to the oil and demand equation.
And that's an interesting point you make, Naeem, because isn't it in the interest of both countries that US shale producers do not benefit from any OPEC plus production cuts?
Like, that's a really interesting thing, because when the prices were trading in around $45, Russia wasn't willing to cut the price because it really wanted the US shale industry to suffer. But now the prices are even more lower. We are, early 30s. That's where the Brent is really, the WTI is really trading at. So it is going to even hurt the US shale industry more as compared to when the prices were trading at 45. So are we going to see some reaction from Saudi Arabia or from OPEC Plus? In my opinion, yes, definitely, because both countries are eager to make some sort of a supply cut very soon. I think it is only a matter of a time before we hear that, and that could really prop up the prices.
Naeem, just a quick thought on Saudi Arabia. Why has it taken so long for Aramco to fall below its IPO price?
Like, the Aramco IPO, the stock price was massively supported by the government buying shares, right? And it is not something new, because we have seen various different central banks supporting the equity market through corporate debt and sometimes even direct intervention into the stock market. Who knows? Today, the European Central Bank could be doing something very similar as well. But to answer your question precisely, I think the Aramco stock price had a massive support from the government.
Let's talk about investors, finally, if we can, Naeem. I mean, it's been a hugely volatile week for the markets, hasn't it? I mean, how should small investors trade the market now? Where should they be putting their money right now?
Look, if you're a retail investor, then the current situation presents a huge opportunity. You should be preparing your shopping list now rather than going into the market and start buying it. But if you are a day trader, then the current market volatility presents a huge opportunity, because we are looking at the Dow Jones index, for instance, where 1,000 point is just become a norm. Usually you don't see that sort of a movement in the market. So from an investor perspective, we are down 20%, bear market, official territory, right? But I think the market is still going to continue to move to the downside. So for retail investors, they don't really need to rush into the markets now, because it is going to continue to move lower. It is only a start of a bear market. There is no control of a coronavirus. More worse news is about to come. We're going to see that in the economic data and also baked into earnings as well. So sit tight, keep preparing your shopping list.
Naeem Aslam, thank you very much indeed for talking to Counting the Cost.
Thank you.
Now, the rapid advances in technology may give the appearance that it's all for our own benefit. But at what cost? China has used its vast surveillance network, more than 350 million AI face recognition cameras, to suppress its minority Uyghur Muslims and introduce a controversial social credit system. Well, now India is rolling out cameras under the guise of law and order. It's estimated it plans to spend $4.3 billion by 2024 on the project. Delhi has already captured the biometric records of more than 1 billion people, while the United States has more than 70 million cameras, one for every 4.1 citizens. Washington has warned its agencies and local governments not to buy Chinese-made cameras. But that's not stopping US companies like Fidelity, Silver Lake and Qualcomm from investing in firms critical to China's surveillance network. SenseTime raised $1 billion from investors, valuing the AI company at $4.5 billion. Well, now China has turned its facial recognition network to detect citizens who may have the coronavirus. Al Jazeera's Katrina Yu has this report.
One glance is all that's needed to enter Zhengzhou's subway system. The city is the first in China to set up facial recognition gates in all of its underground stations. The government says it's about customer convenience.
This is especially handy for people who carry a lot of heavy bags, or the people who don't have a cash or their smartphones have run out of battery. These problems could be solved by facial recognition.
Now, facial recognition cameras are being used alongside infrared temperature scanners to help contain the spread of coronavirus. In the city of Hangzhou, a man was reprimanded after facial recognition cameras filmed him leaving his home before completing 2 weeks of self-quarantine. High-tech surveillance cameras allow authorities to access a citizen's travel history. There are more of these in China than in any other country in the world, an estimated 350 million, roughly one for every 4 people.
For now, most commuters in Zhengzhou are using payment cards or mobile phone apps on public transport, but analysts say it won't be long before their faces are the only ticket they need.
The technology is part of the government's nationwide plan to boost security and surveillance. Cameras will be linked to phone and other personal data, making it easier for police to identify and monitor citizens than ever before. For some, the benefits are clear.
I heard about facial recognition recently. It's new and seems very convenient to use.
But others are wary of how their information will be used.
Nowadays, the leaking of private information is common, and the problem is very serious. It's something I'm afraid of.
Facial recognition is used to name and shame minor offenders, such as pedestrians who ignore traffic lights. But the government says it's crucial for catching criminals, and everyone with nothing to hide has nothing to fear.
The positive aspect is because people are now living under the spotlight. They will be more careful with their behavior. But of course, there is a risk privacy is violated and information being abused.
In Xinjiang, human rights groups say Muslims from the Uyghur minority are being monitored and imprisoned using the vast digital surveillance network, one which several US technology companies have helped build. In Zhengzhou, people can so far choose whether to use facial recognition gates. But soon, there may be no way out.
Well, joining us now from London is Ariq Chowdhury. He's the head of think tank Future Advocacy. Ariq, so talk us through how AI is being used right now, because, of course, the big elephant in the room is China's surveillance system and its draconian use against some ethnic minorities.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is the increased use of facial recognition systems in China, but also across the world. And these systems basically are the output of a decade of selfies on social media. We live in an increasingly data-driven society, and what we've seen over recent years is individuals' facial data being collected and deployed for surveillance systems, but also identity verification systems. And China is perhaps at the more extreme end of those deployments.
Ariq, so what about then more democratic societies like the UK, India and the US? I mean, they're rolling out systems under the guise of fighting crime, but the evidence to date from the UK hasn't been a resounding success, has it?
I mean, the UK in lots of respects is a world leader in how to run a surveillance state. It's important to remember the context which the UK finds itself in. London is the second most surveilled city in the world with 420,000 CCTV cameras, for example, which is just behind Beijing, which is on a few thousand more, and is far ahead of Washington, which only has 30,000 CCTV cameras. And the way it's being used in London is, yes, as you said, for surveillance purposes. So each individual now in London, for example, will be subjected to facial recognition cameras, which essentially scans the facial data on individuals' faces in a way that's very different, actually, to how CCTV has worked. And I guess the main difference between the UK and perhaps China is that there are, in theory, some checks and balances in the UK, whereas in China it's being used for almost everything. You can't get a mobile SIM card without having to subject yourself to a facial recognition scan in China.
And we know that the US has cautioned against using Chinese-made camera systems. What's the state of play here, Ariq?
The US, actually, there's a lot more pushback, I think, against facial recognition systems, especially in California, where most of these tech companies are based. They are themselves imposing bans on facial recognition systems, even though that's where the developers are. So they do seem to be a bit further ahead in terms of pushing back against this kind of technology. Whereas in the UK, China, India is another example. India is rolling out facial recognition systems, in particular for elections. So if you want to go and vote at a polling station, they are trialing facial recognition cameras at a number of polling stations now in India. Also, actually, within the wider context of the coronavirus scandal, you're seeing facial recognition systems being deployed in different parts of the world.
And it is worth pointing out that despite all the controversy surrounding all this, it hasn't stopped private equity and funds from buying into Chinese companies that are streets ahead in AI facial recognition technology, Arik.
Yeah, it's potentially a huge market in the future if you think about it, because this would be of interest to every security service across the world. Every police force across the world will potentially be interested in facial recognition technology for surveillance. So those companies that get ahead of it now are potentially going to be in a leading position in the future. And you are seeing companies in China perhaps leaping ahead in this space.
And just a final thought to you, Arik. How close are the big Chinese tech companies to the actual Chinese state itself? Because we know that some technology is being used as a tool for social control in China.
There's a lot of overlap. The reason why China is so powerful when it comes to technology is because they have so much state backing for a lot of their new developments, whereas in the US, it's dependent on Silicon Valley, and the EU is dependent on pooling together the resources across member states. China has a lot of state investment and state supports for their technology startups. So the example I gave earlier about the mobile SIM cards, this is a mandated system in China. And there's also, they're leaping ahead so far now that there's a recent report that there are cameras in China which can identify individuals even if they're wearing a medical face mask. So there's a really almost quite a big gulf in difference between how far ahead China is versus the rest of the world.
Arik Chowdhury, thank you very much indeed for talking to Counting the Cost. Now, for the first time in its history, Lebanon says it will default on its $90 billion debt mountain. The Prime Minister, Hassan Diab, in a televised address said, "How can we pay creditors and there are people in the streets who do not have the money to buy a loaf of bread?" Sena Hodder in Beirut has more.
Businesses are closing, unemployment is rising, inflation is soaring, and the local currency depreciated by at least 50%. And now, for the first time in its history, Lebanon is defaulting on paying its debt. The country is facing its worst economic crisis in decades. Prime Minister Hassan Diab, who took office in January after massive protests toppled the previous government, told the nation his administration will work on restructuring the debt which has become too much for the country to bear.
Our hard currency reserves are at a critical record low. As a result, the Republic of Lebanon is forced to default the coming March 9th obligation on the Eurobond. These funds must be channeled towards securing the basic necessities for the Lebanese people.
People have been on the streets for months demanding a new leadership. They have little faith in a government appointed by the old political class they accuse of corruption. Demonstrators have also vented their anger at banks for imposing capital controls, but bankers are blaming the authorities for looking for an easy way out.
Restructuring the public debt seems to be a way to avoid the other reforms that are necessary to jumpstart the economy and to solve the crisis, which is essentially restructuring the public sector. Some parties in Lebanon have been used to look at the public sector as a source of benefits and favors to their political constituencies.
International donors have made clear there will be no assistance unless reforms are carried out.
It's not just about implementing reforms. Lebanon's new government does not have many friends. It is seen by the United States and its allies as controlled by Hezbollah, an Iranian-backed group they consider a terrorist organization. And they have been trying to contain Iran's growing influence in the Middle East.
The only option to secure foreign funding and without risking further isolation is through the International Monetary Fund. But Hezbollah, the power broker in government, has rejected an IMF bailout. It says it would involve taxes and calls the institution a tool of the United States.
I mean, in case Hezbollah signs up to the IMF, they will lose some of the sovereignty they've won in the 2018 elections, the first election that they've won since 2005. And if they lose that power, this means that they've conceded some sort of defeat to the IMF and to the international community and to the United States.
Lebanon's financial crisis has entered a new stage, and there doesn't seem to be a rescue plan. And as conditions worsen for the people, many are warning of further unrest.
And Zaina joins us live now from Beirut. Zaina, so talk us through what this default means for the Lebanese economy.
Well, it just shows how bad the state of the economy is and how bankrupt the Lebanese government is. It's unable to pay a debt worth $1.2 billion. That is not a large amount for a state. Yes, the government has to pay almost $5 billion until the end of the year. But according to the Prime Minister, there isn't enough money. They have to save whatever they have left, the dwindling currency reserves, to pay for the basic needs of the people. Wheat, fuel, medicine. The government needs $10 billion until the end of this year to ensure that it can import those products for the Lebanese people. So a dire state of the economy, the first time really in Lebanon's history. And now the government needs to enter negotiations with creditors in order not to be sued. It really shows you that Lebanon has lost its place in international financial markets. Officials, ministers, they're talking about weeks before they can come up with a government rescue plan, a plan that will reduce spending and raise revenues, because this country spends more than it earns, and the debt really has been a burden. Servicing the debt, just paying for the interest of the debt, has been very, very difficult. So it just shows you how bad the economy is.
And Zaina, it does beg the question, though, is the IMF the only institution that can help here? I mean, there's no chance other Middle Eastern countries could step up and assist?
Well, like we mentioned earlier, this is a government that doesn't have many friends. And it's not just that. Those in power are people who are not trusted by the international community. International donors have repeatedly said time and time again, we're not bailing you out this time. We want you to implement reforms. What does structural and economic reforms mean? It means that these politicians will no longer have access to state resources. They're going to have to clamp down on corruption, on tax evasion, on custom evasion. They're going to have to trim the public sector. They've been using the public sector to provide jobs to their own supporters. And so far, there is no commitment or serious commitment on the part of the authorities to do just that. And so that's why many believe the International Monetary Fund is the only way forward. But Hezbollah, which is the power broker in the government, is refusing. It's saying that this is a tool that the United States uses, a financial institution that the United States uses to impose its wishes on the country. But they may not have much of a choice, because this country needs billions of dollars in order to restart the economy and jumpstart the economy.
So, Zaina, what does this then mean for the people? I mean, the Prime Minister has made it clear that the state has already failed them.
Yes, he said that the state is facing immense difficulties and we can no longer provide a decent life to the Lebanese people. People are getting poorer. Businesses are closing. People are losing their jobs. And now, with the coronavirus and government measures demanding restaurants close, pubs close, more and more people are losing their jobs. And the value of the Lebanese currency, it has lost a lot of value, the purchasing power. People are finding it very, very hard to make ends meet. And it's not just that. You can't access your savings in banks. There's a cap on how much money you can withdraw from banks, and they're not giving much dollars. So people are being forced to use the Lebanese pound, which, like I mentioned, is losing its value. But at the end of the day, people have held months of protests against the government, calling for a new leadership, calling for a new election. But they were faced with a very militarized state, a state which is intent, or politicians who are intent on staying in power. So the situation is quite dire for the Lebanese people.
OK, Zaina Hodder there in Beirut. Zaina, thank you. Well, that's our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to your page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. Well, that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Darren Jordan. From the whole team here, thanks for joining us. The news at Al Jazeera is next.